When Jesus was a young child, I don't think it got quite as cold as it is outside today in Palestine, but I predict there were some cold, winter, dark months. And, this past month, we've been looking at the ways in which Jesus grew up and what we can learn from that. And I suspect that on the cold, dark, short days, that in the evenings, Mary would tell the kids stories. She certainly couldn't just turn on Netflix or hand the kids an iPad and go do some chores. So they would entertain the children, entertain the whole family with stories. And I imagine Mary with Jesus and the other children around her sharing the stories of ancestors, family stories. The story of how Mary and Joseph first met, the story of that awkward night in Bethlehem when there was no place to sleep, the story of Jesus' grandparents and their grandparents and all the names that we just heard. Jesus would hear about the courage of David, the faith of those who walked out of Egypt, the persistence of Jacob, the devotion of Abraham, the trust shown by Noah. These family stories would have shaped who Jesus became because all of us, all human beings, are natural storytellers. The Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman suggests that there are actually two parts of every human being. We have the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self stays in the moment, is only aware of what's around us. The remembering self creates a narrative out of those experiences. And studies have backed this up and found interesting things, like, for instance, human beings tend to only remember the peak of an event and the end. So if you end on a bad note, it sours the whole experience, even if it was like a really beautiful symphony before then. So no pressure, I have to end on a really strong note today, otherwise you're just going to remember the peak and a really bad ending. We inherit more than just DNA from our parents. We inherit family stories, and because we're storytellers, these stories shape us. So think about right now, what were the stories that you were told when you were growing up? Did you learn about how family members overcame hardship? Did you learn about the different ways different people showed their love? Funny stories, sad stories. These family stories have a fascinating effect on our lives. There's research at Emory that has actually shown that kids who hear more about their family stories tend to be more resilient. And the theory is that these stories convey a sense of connection and belonging. They give these children hope that they too can overcome the obstacles that they might face in life. So simply taking time to tell stories can help your children become stronger and better equipped to face a sometimes tough world. And then as we all grow older, we end up picking and choosing from among family stories to help identify who we want to be as adults. Perhaps we've always been told we're kind of like that one particular relative, and so we sort of internalize their stories and how they would act and how they approached problems. These stories shape us. But of course, we know that stories have some good and some bad in them. I mean, just look at the stories from Jesus' ancestors that I just list off. David killed a guy because he wanted his wife. Jacob lied a lot and stole, and Abraham didn't come off smelling like roses with that whole Hagar situation. There's good and bad in every family. There's good and bad in every moment and in every story. I remember a few years ago teaching a class at Macon to undergraduates, and we were talking about great moral leaders throughout history. And today we struggle with what to do with these stories, these people from prior generations who get passed down to us. And every class, the temptation was to assess whether someone deserved the title of moral leader. We would sort of add up all of their bad qualities and add up all of their mistakes and faults, and there would be like this drive to figure out thumbs up, thumbs down, whether they qualified as moral, whether they qualified as a leader. And I would over and over suggest that this was the wrong question. Instead of asking, was this person a moral leader, or was this ancestor a good role model, we should be asking, what can I learn from this person? How can this person teach me to be a moral leader myself? How can we assess strengths and weaknesses? And so we can apply that same thing to our own lives. We don't need to ask, based on this story, was Grandpa a good parent to my mom or dad? We can ask, what can I learn from how Grandpa handled problems? What qualities do we want to pass on to the next generation? What behaviors do we think maybe we could let go of? What attitudes can we allow to slip away? Someone who was cruel might also have had a hilarious sense of humor at other times. Someone who always just created more problems than needed to be might also be a really hard worker. We can assess and decide what we want to pass along and what meaning to take from stories. And so we need to embrace our family stories, but also ask hard questions of them. And this becomes even more important when you realize that family stories can often be a way of concealing or passing along toxic, unhelpful, unhealthy dynamics. For instance, sometimes a story or a whole set of stories will consistently overinflate the role of a single individual, leave others out. Or the flip side, they'll consistently put down one person in the family, and that behavior, that dynamic continues. Other warning signs include stories that only focus on the good things that a person did and kind of use that to hide maybe some questionable or problematic behavior. There are stories that rewrite family histories. There's stories that change what happened to help one person or another. There are stories where one person is left out altogether and we don't talk about Bruno. No. If you haven't watched Encanto, the new Disney movie, you have no idea what I'm talking about right now. And if you have watched it, then that song is now stuck in your head, and for that you have my deepest apologies. So let's catch up here. Family stories are powerful. They are a positive influence on us, and if they are hard to deal with, we can still find value in them by asking questions not like, is this a good story, but what can we learn? And the process of doing that can help us avoid some toxic stories that perpetuate toxic dynamics. And so with all of this in mind, let's go back to today's gospel lesson. It was from Luke chapter 3, but if you open your Bible at home, I'm willing to bet it's going to look a little bit different. Because today we heard a translation from Dr. Wilda Gaffney, a wonderful womanist Bible scholar, and Dr. Gaffney did something awesome. Dr. Gaffney added in all the women in all those generations that many, many hundreds of years of male writers, scribes, and translators just left out. She mentions Mary as well as Joseph, Bathsheba as well as David, Ruth as well as Boaz, Tamar, Leah, Rebecca, Sarah, Eve. And of course she did, because do you think when Mary was sitting there with those children telling these stories that she just forgot about all the women in the family? Everything that we know about how Jesus treated women in his lifetime tells us that he heard these stories of these remarkable, powerful, amazing women. He knew about the courage of Ruth, the strategic brilliance of Rebecca, who ensured that her son got his birthright. He knew that Sarah had strengths and failings. He knew about Miriam. He knew he could draw lessons and inspiration from the good qualities and the bad qualities. These women were part of these stories. So stories define our lives. That means we should get them right. We should have the courage to retell them in new and interesting ways. We should have the courage to rediscover the people who were left out of the way the story was told once ago. And we can reevaluate people's actions in those stories, but it's not because we want to cancel them, but it's because we want to learn from them. We want to pattern our lives on people who are decent and compassionate and brave and honest and kind. It's the end of January. It's a little bit cold outside. I'm from Syracuse, New York, and even I will admit that it's a little bit chilly. Come on. By Atlanta standards, it's freezing. It's dark. It gets dark early, and so we're finding things to do indoors. And I want to suggest maybe we should turn off the TV and even put down the book and tell each other stories. Tell each other family stories, or pick up the phone and ask for family stories. Find out what it was like for your grandparents or your parents when they were growing up, if you don't know already. Ask, who among your family are you most like? Ask, what's the story of how you got your name or your middle name? Maybe you know already. Maybe you'll find something new. Ask, what was the biggest mistake and the best decision that your parents ever made, that their parents ever made? Share these stories and then ask questions about these stories. What stories are being overlooked? Who's missing from all of these stories? What would you have done differently? What can you learn? What would you pass on to the next generation? The novelist Brian Morton writes, "The world, the human world, is bound together not by protons and electrons, but by stories. Nothing has meaning in itself. All the objects in the world would be shards of bare, mute blankness, spinning wildly out of orbit, if we didn't bind them together with stories." All of our reality, all of our lives are just bits of stuff until a story brings it to life. And God is the ultimate storyteller. And so it reminds us that the life of faith is not saying, yes, I agree to X, Y, Z, but the life of faith is realizing I'm part of a story that God is still writing. It's about discovering yourself as a character and having new set of family stories. The Bible is this collection of family stories that God wanted us to have, stories passed down by ancestors, stories that can shape us and mold us in their telling and their retelling. For Jesus, they were literally the stories of his biological family, but for us, they're the stories of our chosen family, the family of God. We're still writing this story, and we can do so by shaping and challenging and loving and asking hard questions about all of our family stories, our own, the stories we find in the Bible, the stories in our history. So today, think about how this week you're going to plan some time to share stories, ask questions about stories, reshape and retell stories. But never forget the most important story. The story of the family God is trying to create in this messed up world. A family of all of us different, imperfect people. A family in which all of us belong and all of us are loved.